Hi, everybody. I'm Brittany Lewis with Forbes Breaking News. Joining me now is Gregory, Brew, Analyst with Eurasia Group. Gregory, thank you so much for joining me once again.
Thanks so much for having me back on.
This week passed the 7-month mark from the beginning of the Israel-Hamas war, and I want to talk about where we are right now. Hamas announced it accepted a ceasefire proposal from Israel, and Israel said that the agreement was, quote, far from meeting Israel's core demands. Where are we in terms of this conflict and in terms of a potential ceasefire?
Well, really, over the last week, there have been two big questions. The first question was, will there be a ceasefire? In other words, will Israel and Hamas agree to a deal that ends the fighting for a period of several weeks, that allows the release of hostages that Hamas have been holding since October 7th, and that brings an end to the fighting in Gaza? The second question, which is, of course, related to the first question, is would Israel begin an offensive operation in Rafah? This, of course, is the city at the southern tip of Gaza. It is where most of the Gaza population is currently located. Over 1 million people have been taking shelter in Rafah over the last several months. But it is also where Hamas remains in a position. There are at least 4 battalions of Hamas fighters present in Rafah. There are a number of tunnels present in the town. And Israel has made it very clear that it does not consider its operation in Gaza complete until it is able to move into Rafah. So over the last 48 hours, we've seen developments on both of these fronts. As far as the Rafah operation goes, Israel has begun the operation. There have been airstrikes against Hamas targets in the city. There have been reports of Israeli ground troops moving into the city as well, even though there remain large numbers of civilians present. On the ceasefire talks, we seem to have hit yet another roadblock. Negotiators were present in Egypt up until today discussing a potential ceasefire deal. But reports suggest that both the Israeli and U.S. teams, led by CIA Director Bill Burns, have left Egypt, indicating that the ceasefire talks have reached yet another stalemate. So for the moment, a ceasefire doesn't appear to be in the cards, and Israel does appear to be proceeding into Rafah, despite President Biden's comments yesterday regarding continued U.S. aid.
Let's talk about those comments because Rafa has been a topic of conversation, especially within the past few days. As we know, weeks ago, President Biden said an Israeli offensive into Rafa was a red line for him. Just last night on a CNN interview, President Biden said that he would not send Israel weapons or artillery to support the Rafa invasion. What do you make of his comments?
Well, there's a little bit of nuance into what the United States is saying right now, what President Biden has been saying. As you note, several weeks ago, Biden did lay out a red line indicating that the U.S. would start to take measures withholding certain amounts of military aid if Israel proceeded with an offensive in Rafah that did not meet U.S. requirements. The U.S. had been looking for a concrete plan from Israel related to the evacuation of civilians, related to the continued flow of humanitarian aid into Gaza. The United States has been quite clear that it does not support an Israeli offensive into Rafah without some kind of plan to manage the civilian population. What Biden said last night suggests that the U.S. position has changed a little bit. He indicated that the United States really doesn't approve of any kind of Israeli offensive into Rafah, and that the U.S. would start withholding offensive weaponry. He and his administration have been clear that this weaponry includes airdropped bombs, artillery shells, other kinds of offensive weapons that Israel could use against Hamas and Rafah. The United States will not stop delivering defensive weaponry, including armaments used by Israel's Iron Dome anti-missile protection system. Other forms of aid will continue to flow. But what Biden has been signaling now is that he doesn't want to see an Israeli offensive into Rafah. He wants Israel to halt. The implicit suggestion here is that the United States wants to see Israel focus on a ceasefire deal. There's been a lot of pressure from the United States on the Netanyahu government towards a ceasefire deal, but given that talks in Egypt seem to have reached yet another stalemate, and given that Israel appears to be continuing its offensive into Rafah, regardless of what President Biden says, it's a little unclear as to what kind of impact the U.S. shift in position will really have in the short term.
How big of a shift would you quantify this as? Because President Biden, from the beginning, from October 7th, has said we are a steadfast ally with Israel. Now he never said we weren't an ally, but he did say that there will be conditions when it comes to artillery and weapons. So can you talk about that shift a bit?
There absolutely has been a shift, but I do think Biden and his administration are trying to walk a very fine line here. There was a press conference today where a spokesperson for the White House said very clearly the United States has not stopped being an ally to Israel, that the flow of other kinds of weapons will continue. The flow of aid to Israel will continue. The United States is not reevaluating its position as an ally of Israel. But at the same time, the U.S. is trying to send a message regarding certain kinds of offensive weapons related to certain kinds of operations in Rafah. There have been some suggestions that the U.S. would be somewhat more open to a more limited operation if Israel went into Rafah in a smaller way, if they focused on eliminating Hamas leadership, if they focused on using airstrikes to degrade the Hamas position in Rafah without a large ground offensive. Comments from the White House and from President Biden suggests that there may be some support for that kind of operation. So there has been a shift, but the White House, I think, is still conscious of trying to walk this line. And part of the reason for that is the backlash that President Biden has experienced over the last 24 hours. We've seen a lot of criticism from Republicans, including criticism from certain Senate Democrats. There have been pushback from, of course, from the Israeli government. Prime Minister Netanyahu has been saying that Israel will continue with its operation in Rafah, regardless of what the United States does. And I think President Biden is conscious of retaining his position, of retaining the U.S. position as an ally to Israel, and is wary of attracting too much criticism. So they're trying to have it both ways with this new shift in weapons policy. But right now, it's a little bit unclear as to how extensive that policy shift really is.
I want to talk about that response because there was a lot of backlash and it was swift. And you pointed this out on social media that it really can be divided into two sections here. On the one hand, people are critical that Republicans and Democrats that I've seen that they feel that President Biden is turning his back on Israel. On the other side, other people have suggested that this is too little, too late from the Biden administration. What do you make of this, and how is the Biden administration and President Biden himself doing towing that line down the middle?
Well, of course, any of these decisions, any of these actions have to be put in their appropriate context, right? As you noted at the top, this is 7 months into this war. This war has been going on for a long time. It's increasingly proven to be a drag on President Biden as he approaches this year's re-election, as he approaches this year's election contest against Donald Trump. I think the administration is trying to have it both ways here, where they retain support from Americans who continue to look favorably on Israel, continue to want to see the United States support Israel. They, I think, in their position, want to continue that relationship. Biden has been very clear that he is a strong friend to Israel. He has denounced the Hamas attack many, many times. But at the same time, there has clearly been a growing amount of criticism, a growing amount of frustration, particularly from the left wing of the Democratic Party, particularly from younger voters who have helped Biden in the 2020 election, have supported him so far. There's clearly been a lot of criticism from that camp towards his policies in support of Israel. The response to this shift in U.S. aid for Israel reflects 7 months of growing frustration from the left wing of the Democratic Party, as well as the criticisms that are coming from those who would support Israel. So in a way, it is a little bit too little, too late. And I think the fact that the Biden administration is trying to walk this line is making it even harder for them to address those criticisms.
While the Biden administration is walking this line, saying we remain an ally of Israel, also conditioning weapons going to Israel, do you think that this impacts the U.S.-Israel relationship at all?
Well, the U.S.-Israeli relationship, goes deeper than just the Biden-Netanyahu relationship. Obviously, there's been a lot of friction between the Netanyahu government and the Biden administration over this war and over other issues. I mean, Biden has been quite frank in his frustrations with Bibi in the past. But you have to remember that, the United States and Israel have been allies going back many years. There's a deep degree of military, security, and intelligence cooperation. There, of course, are deep economic ties and deep cultural ties, right? The United States has a very, very large Jewish population. There is a lot of support for Israel amongst various aspects of American society. So the U.S.-Israeli relationship has certainly come under stress. I don't think it's going to buckle or collapse anytime soon, but I think this war has put a great deal of pressure on Democrats and how the Democratic Party sees its relationship, not just with Israel, but with Netanyahu and others within the war cabinet who want to continue the fight against Hamas, see Israel in a less secure position now than it was before the October 7th attack. And I think there is, a degree of uncertainty and concern about what happens after. At some point, the war in Gaza will end, or it will draw towards some kind of conclusion. And there is concern about what Israel does when it's done with Hamas. Will it turn its attentions towards Hezbollah? Will there be an increasing risk of war with Lebanon? Will there be another exchange of drones and missiles with Iran following last month's attack? So I think we're in a period of uncertainty regarding the U.S.-Israeli relationship and where it goes, not only regarding the situation in Gaza, but regarding Israel's place in the region as a whole.
You said something key earlier in our conversation, that when it comes to this topic, context is important. Do you think when it comes to the Rafah invasion or this war as a whole, as we sit here 7 months out, do you think anything's missing from this conversation?
Well, I think a few of the items that I just mentioned, right? What comes after? Right now, the focus is laser focused on Rafah, which I think is appropriate, right? It's going to be an incredibly difficult situation. There are over 1 million civilians present in Rafah. There is, of course, still a Hamas presence in Rafah. But something that I've also been seeing and I've been following more closely is the fact that Hamas has reemerged in other parts of Gaza, right? It's been 7 months of war, but Israel has not yet brought the whole of Gaza under its control. It has not completely reduced the Hamas presence elsewhere in the territory. And there is a growing risk that even if Israel succeeds in eliminating or significantly degrading the Hamas presence in Rafah, Hamas itself will probably survive. The consensus from the beginning of the war is that Hamas is unlikely to be completely destroyed by military action. So even if the Rafah offensive takes place, even if it is largely successful, at least from Israel's point of view, will Israel succeed in its war aims in Gaza? It remains unclear whether the war can be won solely through military aims. Also, what happens to Gaza when the war is over, right? We've seen a lot of talk about a two-state solution. We've heard a lot of talk about setting up a post-war Gaza government, perhaps under the Palestinian Authority. This talk has been going on for months without any kind of real clear resolution. It remains very unclear as to who or what will govern Gaza and who will pay for its reconstruction. Those are the issues that I have been thinking about more recently as we get closer to a Rafah offensive.
You bring up a really good point of Hamas cropping up in other parts of Gaza, not Rafah exclusively. So I am curious, is this war only going to be over when all of Hamas is completely decimated? And is there any indication of when that would be?
It's very unclear what state Hamas is in currently, right? We know that it is still present in Rafah, that it still has a military organization there. Various leaders, including Yahya Sinwar, who masterminded the October 7th attack, remain at large, remain present, likely in Rafah, in entrenched positions. This is part of the reason why Israel is so focused on eliminating the Hamas position in Rafah. But as I mentioned, Hamas remains active elsewhere in Gaza. There are multiple areas where the Israeli military have moved in, eliminated the Hamas presence, declared victory, left, only for Hamas to reemerge several months, if not weeks later. So what happens to Hamas in the aftermath of a Rafah offensive remains unclear. There has been, I think, a broad consensus that eliminating it through military means is probably impossible, that there probably needs to be some kind of political process around eliminating Hamas entirely. But as I mentioned, there doesn't seem to be much progress right now about what happens in Gaza when the war is over. That, to me, is the crucial question that will resolve whether this war ends in victory for Israel or if it leads to a new, more uncertain and more insecure status quo in the aftermath of the October 7th attack.
So, Gregory, all eyes are on Rafah. All eyes are also on what's next after a Rafah invasion. Thank you so much for joining me. I appreciate the conversation, and I hope you come back again soon.
Thank you so much. It was a pleasure.